Hello everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today to share with you the findings on a study to sustainably develop the Marianas into a multi-island destination. Although the Marianas is home to 14 islands, development in the past has predominantly been focused on Saipan. And even though a revitalization of Saipan could be achieved through the upgrade of existing facilities as well as the introduction of global brands, in order to truly elevate the positioning of the Marianas as a multi-island destination to prepare it for the post-COVID travel era, the opportunities really lie within the lesser developed islands. Post-COVID, as travel becomes slightly more difficult, people are likely to take shorter trips but spend longer time on their trips. And this is the perfect opportunity for the Marianas to explore its other islands and develop itself into a multi-island destination that offers a variety of products and experiences that complement each other. And today we'll talk about the various islands and the opportunities that lie within each of them. And since many of you are on the beautiful island of Tinian today, we'll start with Tinian and move on to look at the Northern Islands, Rota, followed by Saipan, and finally wrapping it all up together to look at the Marianas as a sustainable multi-island destination. Let's begin by looking at Tinian's strengths. One of its biggest strengths is its vicinity to Saipan, as well as its natural beauty. Tinian is home to a number of beautiful beaches, crystal clear water, and snorkeling and diving sites in and around the island. There are plenty of hiking opportunities, and it is well known for its presence during World War II, where the Northfield was one of the busiest airfields, military airfields at the time. Apart from this, Tinian is great at hosting festivals, and the annual Pika Festival has successfully become a regional highlight. Tinian is also home to some existing infrastructure that allows for the development of the recommendations that are provided in this presentation to be carried out in the immediate term. Some of its challenges are that 2/3 of the island is under a long-term military lease, which leaves the southern 1/3 of the island available for tourism development. This not only limits the size of the island available for tourism development, the military component is also likely to have significant impacts on the tourism experience itself. In addition to that, comparative to Saipan, Tinian has somewhat limited infrastructure, which adds to the development cost for investors, particularly for larger projects. This is also closely related to access, for example. In the past, when Tinian had both the ferry and the flights that are still available currently, it was able to accommodate for a larger number of visitors. Historically, Tinian was able to accommodate for about 40,000 visitors, including day visitors and overnight visitors when the ferry was running. However, the good news is that I understand that, for example, during the Pika Festival, the ferries run again, showing that improvements to access is obtainable with demand. And that leads us to the biggest opportunity in that Tinian has a lot of natural and cultural resources that are suited to the development of attractions that are ideal for day visitors, particularly those staying on Saipan. And we'll look today at all the recommendations that's related to developing this. At the same time, it's important to recognize that some of the threats, key ones are, like I mentioned, impact from the military component, which is going to be highly dependent on the ultimate level of use. But regardless of that, given the military component, it is going to be difficult to find the niche in terms of traditional tourism for Tinian, which leads us to the need to recognize that it's important to avoid excessively sized developments, particularly for the accommodation component in the immediate term. Having looked at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for Tinian, let's move on to look at the recommendations and how to turn Tinian into an ideal day trip getaway of the Marianas. Like I mentioned, one of the largest driving factors is that the planned military component makes Tinian less ideal for tourism development in the traditional sense. In terms of accommodation demand, a lot of destinations that have a significant military component, which is often a permanent military base, tends to generate significant accommodation demand as well as demand for businesses related to the military base. However, I understand that that's not the case for Tinian with the training that's being planned. And with the training component, one of the biggest things to address is that its impact on the environment as well as the setting for tourists and their experiences needs to be managed as much as possible, with the key being preserving the environment that Tinian has now, which is basically all of its cultural and natural resources that we're going to be talking about are the basis for developing Tinian into an ideal day trip destination. Therefore, it will be critical to preserve these resources and preserve the environment. And with all of that, given Tinian's vicinity to Saipan, it really allows for ideal opportunities to develop it into a day trip island and ideally add to the activities component of the Marianas. And all of this is dependent on access, of course. So let's talk about access. The number one critical component would be a scheduled ferry service from Saipan, supplemented by flights that are still running currently. With the flights alone, it wouldn't be sufficient to support Tinian as a day trip destination simply because of the number of people that the flights could conveniently bring to Tinian. Having a scheduled ferry service allows for a larger number of day trippers to conveniently get to Tinian from Saipan, and also makes it easier for residents as well as the transport of supplies and equipment. In general, on the topic of inter-island transport, it is oftentimes the lifeline of smaller islands. And in a lot of destinations, especially during lower demand periods, it is often subsidized. Some examples of this for island destinations are Fiji and French Polynesia. These are two of the highest yielding resort destinations. Both of them have national carriers, and the national carriers have their domestic counterparts to service the smaller islands. Many of these smaller islands are home to some of the most iconic tourism resources for these two places. And similarly, in the case of the Marianas, and we're talking about Tinian at the moment, travel and ticket prices need to be kept to a level that's acceptable to tourists in order for this day trip model to work successfully. And so during the ramp up period, at least when demand is still building, subsidies may be necessary in order to make it successful. This is especially critical during the establishment period. In order for Tinian to be established as a reliable day trip destination in the minds of travelers, there needs to be a dependable schedule for both the ferry and the flights. And particularly during the build-up period, if demand is slower to ramp up, the schedules need to be maintained and have a longer-term view to sustain and develop the destination into a successful day trip option. And this may require subsidies that needs to be looked at, particularly during the ramp-up period. In addition to the core services for transport, there could be other more creative options, including helicopters, which many tourists like to see as an experience in and of itself. In addition to seasonal fishing excursions during the summer months when the tides allow for a calmer experience. So for example, fishing excursion that originate from Saipan and end in Tinian. Having looked at access, let's now take a look at the overview of an action plan that could develop Tinian into a successful day trip island. And the number one thing is to return to fundamentals, to revitalize and build upon Tinian's existing natural and cultural resources, to make it into a successful day trip option and capture the guest base that has hundreds of thousands of guests arriving by Saipan to the Marianas each year. In order to attract these guests, the core of what Tinian has to offer could be 3 signature attractions: the House of TAGA, hiking and biking trails on Punta Carolinas, and TAGA Beach. This could then be supplemented by 2 additional options, Northfield and AGUIGUAN. And finally, to explore Tinian's strengths at hosting festivals and providing great local cuisine, and look at the festival and events related tourism sector. So we'll talk about each of these in more detail. First, starting with the signature attractions. The number 1 signature attraction being developing the House of TAGA into a more interactive experience. The latte stones are definitely impressive, and the Marianas is the only place in the world to see them, which makes it a great asset. However, at the moment, the experience revolves more around just looking at the latte stones. So in order to make it a more interactive experience and a greater attraction overall, the idea is to establish a visitor center that provides more information, not only on the latte stones themselves, but also on the historical period and also the way of life of the Chamorro people back then. If available, there could also be opportunities to bring in artifacts and relics to make the experience stand out more. There could also be the option to have residents on site to talk to visitors, as well as educational programs for regional school groups. And to talk in more detail about the recommendations, I'll highlight this through an example development, Stonehenge in England. As you can see from the picture here, it does have some similarities with House of TAGA and the latte stones, given that these stones were put in place during the prehistoric period about 4,500 years ago. And they were transported without any vehicle, of course, from about 240 miles away. However, prior to 2013, when the visitor center was developed, the experience mainly revolved around, once again, just looking at these stones. The visitor center with a museum and exhibition component that showcases, once again, not only the stones, but the period and how people could have lived back then, the prehistoric time, really brought the experience to life. The visitor center also had reconstructed villages and staff working in the villages to show the ways of life back then. They also have some creative ways of presenting the information, including having a life-size roller system that historians theorized that could have been used to transport the stones. And really seeing this brings the experience to life and really makes visitors appreciate how difficult it could have been for all of this to have happened. I think in a similar fashion with the latte stones, providing more interactive information and perhaps having reconstructed ways to show how people lived back then could really elevate the experience and make it into a signature attraction. Moving on to the second signature attraction, exploring the hiking and biking trails at Punta Carolinas. There's a lot of interesting and resourceful assets that could be used here, including limestone forests, the wild chili peppers, historic shrines, as well as looking at bird and wildlife. And really developing this starts with maintenance and revitalization of its existing facilities and making them into signature features. And furthermore, providing, once again, more interactive information, presentation of interesting facts along the way. And there are some potential points of interest in particular, starting with the limestone caves. Oftentimes with these caves, they really present great story opportunities, whether it's information on how they were formed, the different types of caves, and how they relate to the historic period. Pictures you see here are caves that have been turned into attractions, mainly by providing information and stories about them. once again, without information, without the story behind it, it's really just a cave that people see. But giving it information and a story really brings it to life. Other possible points of interest also include information, once again, on the large banyan trees. The one you see here, banyan trees, for example, in Southeast Asia, there are even attractions, whole attractions that are created around large banyan trees. So this is really, again, something else that could be brought to light as a possible point of interest along the hiking trails. And finally, the Tinian Shrine. And the pictures you see here are the historic shrines in Japan. As you can see, they've been kept up and maintained, but they really have been kept in their original state, which blends in very well with the forest setting, and it's kept more organic. And I think a similar thing could be done with the Tinian Shrine, that it needs to be maintained and kept well, but could be kept to its original state to show its historic charm. And moving on to the third potential signature attraction, TAGA Beach. TAGA Beach is really beautiful with crystal clear water and perfect swimming conditions. I've been to TAGA Beach myself and I had wonderful swim there. I think it's one of the most beautiful beaches that I've been to. Once again, I think there's a lot of opportunities to turn this into a signature attraction by enhancing the visitor experience. First of all, revitalizing the steps and the facilities that are there now, but also creating facilities that could be enjoyed, including locally operated concessions, perhaps a signature beach cafe that offers iconic sunset views and picture-ready spots. And this is the setting at TAGA Beach is really perfect for this kind of facilities, as we'll see here. Picture you see here, of course, is TAGA Beach itself. And on the right side, in a very similar setting, is Rick's Cafe in Jamaica, which is constantly rated as one of the best beach bars in the world. I think the setting itself is very similar. Actually, Rick's Cafe is located on much higher cliffside, and lots of guests jump from the cliff. Actually, I think that the location makes it less ideal because it is very high compared to TAGA Beach, with a similar setting, but lower and offering more safety. Looking at the left side is a cafe in Uluwatu in Bali that once again offers unobstructed views, prime sunset opportunities. And both of these cafes purely succeed from the beautiful setting and views alone. They provide beverages and snacks throughout the day, lounge areas. They're great photo opportunities, and sunset drinks at these places are one of the must-do things. And I think there's really opportunity at TAGA Beach to create a similar concession, a similar F&B outlet that turns into a postcard facility for Tinian and for the Marianas. This will be the ideal place to for visitors once they've gone to TAGA, House of TAGA, and they've gone for a hike, to really end their day here by swimming at TAGA Beach and hanging out at the cafe, watching a beautiful sunset. And moving on to other potential attractions, one of the main ones would be to explore opportunities with Northfield, access permitting. This is a vital part of history, I think, with unrealized potential, and it is a national historic landmark. I think lots could be explored. Perhaps moving beyond the event that took place at Northfield itself, or even moving beyond World War II to offer more meaningful experience and touch on a more universal theme on the cost of war and the preciousness of peace. Really, tourism revolving around peace and historic sites has gained lots of popularity in recent years, and I think it's going to continue to do so. For example, I understand that JTB is organizing tours for junior high school students, educational tours that involve historic sites in the region. And this would not only be limited to organized tours in the future, as the younger generation becomes a new generation of travelers historic sites related to peace and to the cost of war would be something that they are interested in. These younger generation of travelers are interested in meaningful experiences and learning while they're traveling. And some example sites include, of course, the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. Lots of sites in Europe as well as in Asia, for example, the memorial sites and museums in Warsaw and the Anne Frank House. And these are all, while they're very, very different, they all relate to the same topic. And I think this is something that could be explored with Northfield. Moving on to even further potential attractions in the longer term, looking at opportunities with AGUIGUAN, known also as Goat Island. It's completely untouched, beautiful nature, and offers lots of opportunities in terms of nature exploration activities. I'm moving away from the attractions, but looking at critical asset for Tinian as well. Tinian is great at hosting festivals. Looking at the success of the Pika Festival, which is a regional highlight event of the year. And to build on this, to make Tinian the festival island of the Marianas, really to aim at having a festival every 2 to 3 months, making it the place that people think about when they think of festivals and events in the Marianas. This would not only attract overseas tourists, but also regional residents. And as the Marianas becomes more developed as a multi-island destination, this will be a great opportunity for different communities to come together. And a prime example of this is the KOLOA Plantation Days in KAUAI. It's really, in the 35th year, has grown to a 10-day event. And as well as for tourists, it's an opportunity for the various communities in KAUAI to come together. There are loads of activities throughout the 10-day period, craft fairs, environment cleanups, trail walks, fishing, coastal hikes, career fairs, educational days for children, story hour, traditional game nights, etc. It's an opportunity to really for people to celebrate their heritage and to celebrate the destination that is their home. And along with festivals are great food, and Tinian has some great specialities, including the famous pepper paste, which I've bought many jars of when I went to Saipan, and also the famous Tinian beef. This really is a highlight and differentiates itself from the more international options available in Saipan, and they could appeal to tourists, but also to regional residents once again. And furthermore, an extension from the festivals is looking at opportunities in sporting events. And there's been growing popularity in terms of tourism related to sports, even more so post-pandemic. And because of the pandemic, there's a significant uptake in more active lifestyles, people that having to exercise more outdoors. And I think this is a trend definitely to stay. Biking, for example, as well as running, even before the pandemic, marathons are highly popular events that attract lots of tourists and demand to destination cities and resort destinations alike. And with the pandemic, I think there's even more people that are actively engaged in lifestyles that revolve around outdoors, biking, running, and with Tinian's landscape in particular and its beautiful environment, I think there's opportunities to potentially explore a niche with trail running, which has gathered a very loyal following of people that want to explore something different. Picture here on the left is trail running in Niseko in Japan, traditionally a ski resort. It's a popular biking destination and in recent years, trail running destination in the summer months. And here is trail running in Peru, in the jungles, which is its speciality and difficult to find in many places. And I think Tinian really has the ideal setting to host something in this regard, and it is a potential niche to be explored. It goes along with with an active lifestyle adventure and fits right in with the adventure component of what the Marianas has to offer as a multi-island destination. And to recap all that we talked about, in the immediate term, it's really ideal for Tinian to be looking at a day trip business model, and that's packaging it with a round trip ferry, giving access to all the 3 signature attractions that we talked about: House of TAGA, the exploration trails at Punta Carolinas, and TAGA Beach and its signature cafe. On top of that, making Tinian the festival island of the Marianas and supplement with great local cuisine as well as sporting events. And in the slightly longer term, looking at options to visit Northfield depending on access at the time and giving guests the options to join Goat Island adventures. And this is all something that could be executed in the short term, given the resources available. And it's really looking at how to make the existing resources better and enhance the experience so that they could be packaged together to make Tinian an ideal day trip destination. In the longer term, as these high quality attractions make Tinian a popular day trip option, many guests may wish to stay the night. And this could trigger the development of smaller owner-operated facilities at first. And as demand builds up over the longer term, investors could be looking at sizable resort developments. And in terms of resort developments suited to Tinian, the most ideal may be beachfront resorts that are branded under established global brands positioned in the upper mid-tier segment. Potential concepts to explore: an ideal one would be a fun, all-inclusive concept that offers great value and emphasizes great recreational facilities and food and beverage options. Again, these are options in the longer term as more overnight demand gets generated from, in the beginning, making Tinian into a successful day trip option. Given how easy it is to get from Saipan to Tinian and the larger amount of guest base that Saipan offers, it is really ideal to be looking at day trip options, once again, developing into more overnight demand in the longer term for Tinian. Now let's move on to look at the Northern Islands, which is going to be all about discovering the ultimate adventure of travel and the true luxury that comes with discovery. The Northern Islands has the opportunity to be positioned as a signature experience of the Marianas, showcasing the true uniqueness of the destination. And given the limited infrastructure on the Northern Islands currently, a liveaboard program or product is really the most ideal opportunity to showcase the Northern Islands and show them to the top end of the market, guests that are in the top end of the market, who are especially guests who are the real adventurers as well as special occasion guests. And by showcasing the Northern Islands through this liveaboard product, in the longer term, there will be potential to explore more permanent facilities. Once again, in the short term, starting with the liveaboard product, which really originated in the Maldives with dive groups, it's now progressed and become quite popular with non-dive groups as well, particularly with executive retreats and Asian guests who are in younger generation Asian guests. It's really the perfect product for smaller group travel that are positioned in the luxury tier. For this experience, guests live on the yacht. And for looking at the Northern Islands in particular, it's important to make sure that the yacht could be customized to make the journey a bit calmer, because compared to the Maldives, for example, or places where this kind of product is more common, the trip to the Northern Islands is likely going to be more rough. Perhaps with the summer months being the calmer months, but overall it's important to make sure that the yacht itself can be customized to make the experience more enjoyable. And while most of the meals will be on board, for example, breakfast and dinner, there's opportunities to really maximize dining on the islands, which is always a highlight. for example, picnics, sunset drinks, and seafood barbecues, for example. And the real luxury lies in exploring the Northern Islands, and that there's lots of activities to do, including, of course, snorkeling and diving along the way and around the islands. Also looking at the beautiful black sand beach on Pagan and exploring hiking around the volcanoes, also the lake on Pagan, endless opportunities. The itinerary could be sailing at night to a different island and really exploring around different islands during the day. There are, of course, apart from staying most of the nights on the yacht, opportunities to explore with glamping. In the short term, it's most likely feasible to be looking at self-contained units when demand ramps up for this product. However, in the longer term, as the Northern Islands become more established via this LIVEABOARD product, there's opportunities to look at, for example, around the lake in Pagan to develop tented camp facilities. This one here is shown here is in South Africa, and I think it's a setting that really could be something suited to Pagan and to the lake area. And once again, this is all based on the premise that the Northern Islands and their beautiful environments and all of that is well preserved. And particular to Pagan, for example, if any military exercises are to significantly change the island, that would once again significantly impact the touristic opportunities with these islands. And now moving on to look at Rhoda. Really, Rhoda offers the opportunity to give guests the return to nature experience, but with better and easier access than the Northern Islands. The idea is to once again preserve its natural beauty, to sustain its uniqueness, and promote community-based tourism, which is really small-scale tourism that's located at the premium end of the market, targeting a small amount of guests that are after upmarket products, but are looking for more meaningful experiences. For the accommodation component, it's really looking at small-scale properties, bungalow-style properties under 50 rooms that are at very unique sites, beautiful sites with designs that are unique and harmonious in nature, as well as operations being self-sufficient. And in terms of attractions, the idea with making Rhoda a premium positioning, catering to a smaller amount of premium guests, is to really make the entire island available for these guests to explore at their leisure, which is a luxury that's rarely available at typical larger resort destinations. And that's really turning the entire island into something that they could explore, areas being, for example, the living forest, where they could be looking at wildlife, samba deer, for example, and the bird sanctuary, as well as looking at different trees and plants and flowers, and providing information along the way about all these natural assets, marine preservation, about bringing in coastal walks and really using the pristine environment of Rhoda to talk about the marine ecosystem and preservation efforts that needs to go on globally. And once again, the third component being living in harmony with nature, bringing in tours that revolve around sustainable farming and sustainable fishing. These are all components that really bring in the community of Rhoda, as well as leveraging on how beautiful and pristine and untouched its environment is, to provide a unique experience that's suited to a small amount of visitors. And to make the entire island really easy to experience, the idea is to develop a heritage bike trail that connects most of the iconic lookout areas, cultural sites, historical relics, and scenic spots on Rhoda. And this is going to be the best way to experience the island, and really it's to encourage the small amount of upmarket guests who are going to be staying on Rhoda to explore at a more leisurely pace, and therefore prolonging their length of stay. And now let's move on to look at Saipan. which is envisioned to be the improved General of the Marianas. As many of you know, General is located in Fiji. It's the most concentrated integrated resort in Fiji, located very close to Nadi Airport. And I think it shares lots of similarities with Saipan, being that it is the earliest developed, most mature concentrated tourism area in a multi-island destination. It's the most convenient upmarket cluster from the airport, once again similar to Saipan, and has lots of amenities already that have been developed in the 1970s. So being an earlier destination, earlier development, there are 7 branded resorts in addition to 2 smaller self-contained apartment-style resorts. So there's a sizable amount of inventory, which once again, Saipan has the largest amount of inventory for the Marianas. But given that it was developed earlier in the 1970s, a lot of its facilities have become outdated over the years. And General and its properties really suffered from more limitations in rate or average daily rate compared to occupancy. It's been a very popular destination over the years, but what really suffered was rate. However, the Fiji government and the National Fund, which owns many of the properties in General, recognize how critical it is as a tourism asset for Fiji as a destination. And they've put lots of efforts in to renovate the properties. For example, starting with the Sofitel in 2019, followed by the Westin and the Sheraton, which are some of General's key properties. And really for Saipan, the idea is to improve what is already there, to revitalize the island and make it into the center, the hub of the Marianas with revitalized and better facilities. And that would be starting with the existing facilities, upgrading them and introducing global brands. And I've done a study as well as a presentation on the importance of introducing global brands and the benefits that they could bring to the Marianas as a destination, as well as its developers. This will be followed by the redevelopment or cleanup of unfinished or disused developments that are taking up prime sites on the island of Saipan, and ensuring that any new development is of high quality. Really, Saipan would be about achieving a scale and high quality that would represent the hub of the Marianas. This will be appealing to experienced leisure travelers as well as meeting groups that the destination has missed out on in the past, given the limitations in its facilities and mainly also the lack of global brand representation. So looking at the accommodation component, the main goal is to achieve best use of what's existing on the island. Once again, starting with the upgrade and branding of shoreline resorts. And we can already see in the market, for example, with the Kensington Resort, which has the most modern facilities, even though it has a weaker location outside of Garapan, its rate performance has really shown that there is potential for ADR to improve given better and newer facilities. Following that would be to look at utilizing the currently non-operational properties, particularly ones that are taking up prime sites on Saipan, and how these properties could be utilized to add to the overall inventory. And finally, that any new developments are of high quality, and on the flip side, to avoid unrealistic, unbranded, and or excessively sized developments. For Saipan's attractions, it's a slightly different situation than Tinian and Rota, for example. Given that Saipan is home to the majority of residents of the Marianas, it is important to have a few signature attractions that are key revenue generators for the island, but it's important at the same time to make sure that some areas are kept more resident-centric, given that, once again, it is home to the majority of the residents of the Marianas. So, for example, for beach attractions, in addition to Managaha, consider actively managing additional sites. A lot of tourists are already going to a lot of the beaches on the main island of Saipan, and by actively managing them, for example, in a study that presentation I did on MARPI and turning MARPI into an integrated attraction, it's a model where by actively managing a site, the environment is able to be preserved, and revenue that comes through the management efforts could be put towards, once again, the future preservation of the sites. And this is something that I think Saipan could be looking at for a few additional sites. And moving on to lifestyle amenities, the goal is to make sure that lifestyle amenities available, for example, restaurants, transports, and shopping options are not just touristic, but that it's also for everyone else to enjoy, given that, once again, it is home to a lot of residents. Beginning with the revitalization of Central Garapan and followed by moving beyond Central Garapan, providing more community event spaces and offering high street and off-price retailers, as well as food and beverage outlets that really supplement what's on the island at the moment, which are more geared towards tourists. And these are options, for example, that can be enjoyed by tourists as well as the residents. And finally, if Saipan is to grow in terms of its volume of visitors from the current level, it'd be critical to look at transport options, a bike and go system, and a shuttle bus to relieve any traffic pressure. So these are the recommendations for Saipan, and we'll look at overall now development issues for each island. Beginning with access. And beginning with Saipan, given that it is a hub into the Marianas, the key would be to have daytime scheduled flights to key cities in Asia, as well as daily scheduled flights with Guam. And on the topic of access, it is really something that, once again, like I mentioned, with inter-island access to the Marianas is really a lifeline to the destination. And it is critical to any island destination globally. I think this is a topic that's been talked about a lot. It's more of a chicken and egg situation, which comes first, access or demand. I think it's critical to recognize that even with a very successful destination with high quality products in the destination, for areas that are off of the traditional flying map and are not hubs in terms of the traditional airline model, for example, Fiji and French Polynesia that we talked about earlier, in order to, even though they have great products, in order to ensure access, particularly during downturns, it is important that sometimes access is subsidized through the form of a national carrier, for example. Fiji has Fiji Airways and French Polynesia has Air Tahiti Nui. Both of these airlines are now quite successful stories in terms of national carriers to more remote destinations. However, they haven't always been successful. For instance, Air Tahiti Nui survived 4 years of near bankruptcy between 2011 and 2015, essentially with the help of a rescue fund that was voluntary contributions from all eligible workers in the region. And Air Pacific, which is now Air Fiji, Fiji Airways, it went through years of difficulty and finally was named back to its original name, Fiji Airways, in 2012 after a successful restructuring and turnaround. Both of these carriers have gone through numerous rounds of restructuring, and the airline business is highly volatile. It's subject to a lot of high risk factors, the one that we're looking at now being the pandemic. So in both cases, these national carriers play critical roles in terms of ensuring access for tourists, as well as basic logistics for the entire destinations. Even though they offer strong products, really access is something that is critical to maintain and is an issue to address as a destination. Moving on to recap once again the inter-island access for Tinian, it would be critical to have scheduled ferry service with Saipan, as well as maintaining the current flights that are available. And for Rota to achieve its premium positioning, it would be once again critical to have scheduled flights with Saipan and with Guam. And the lack of flights is one of the key reasons that limits the number of tourists to Rota at the moment. And finally, the Northern Islands in the short to medium term, really looking at the docking of yachts and vessels on demand. And in terms of development timeline priorities, in the immediate term, the most urgent are the upgrading and branding of existing shoreline properties in Saipan, really the utilization and cleanup of key disused structures on Saipan, Tinian, and Rota. And to start within a year, cleanup of Central Garapan, revitalization of Marpi, for example, into an integrated attraction, and looking at, for example, development of the Garapan fishing base to offer better variety of lifestyle amenities and move beyond Central Garapan. And over the next 2 years, the developments that are recommended for Tinian and Rota. In both of these cases, it's realistic to implement these recommendations over the next 2 years because, for example, Tinian, a lot of the recommendations revolve around the utilization of existing resources, and they are realistic to implement in the immediate term. And projects recommended for Rota, for example, are small in scale, and as such would also be realistic to execute. And in the longer term, in the 3 to 5 years period, when tourism achieves full recovery and air access reaches a stable level that allows sophisticated luxury tier travelers to get to the Marianas from various hubs in Asia, that's when it would be the opportune time to look at the development of luxury liveaboard adventure experiences for the Northern Islands. And growing from that, when demand establishes itself and the Northern Islands are more well known in the 5 to 10 year period, looking at opportunities to develop smaller permanent facilities on the Northern Islands. Moving on to looking at community initiatives for the Marianas, really on the island of Saipan, it would be the generation of more employment, providing amenities, and really improving the quality of life for its residents. Also the sale of locally produced products, working with schools, etc., hosting community events. So it's really about improving the quality of life for the large number of residents that live on Saipan. But for Tinian, Rota, and the Northern Islands, a lot of these community initiatives needs to go further, given that these islands are less developed. First of all, any developments would need to be completely self-sufficient, and they need to play a more active role in the preservation efforts and in the improvement of public facilities. Given that these islands are lesser developed, the training and retention of local talent is also going to be critical, and integrating with the smaller community. And in the case of the Northern Islands, in the longer term, encouraging repopulation. Now let's go on to look at the final component of today's presentation, sustainable development targets for the Marianas. In looking at target visitor arrival level, the number one thing is to consider that the Marianas has limited resources, particularly natural resources and labor. And it would be critical to preserve the environment, given that this is what supports tourism in the Marianas in the first place. At the same time, it's important to recognize that the quality of life for residents needs to be improved with development of tourism. Which brings us to the benefits of attracting higher spending visitors rather than just growing the number of visitors. And really, it's about looking at the historical arrival of the Marianas for an estimate of reasonable capacity for existing infrastructure. In addition to that, we also looked at 10 other destinations for their visitor arrivals versus their estimated population versus the land area versus the estimated tourism spending per visitor, which is a key metric that I think the Marianas should be looking at as a comparison. So of these 10 destinations, they can be grouped into mainly 3 groups. The more pristine, which here, as you can see, includes Fiji, French Polynesia, and Palau. And these destinations have around 100 to 500 visitors per square mile. And they've been kept very pristine, which, as you can see, is also reflected in the tourism spending per visitor. With the higher end being French Polynesia over $3,000, and with Palau and Fiji sitting at around $1,200. Moving on to the destinations that are growing more aggressively, but are not suffering from over-tourism. And starting with Kauai, that sits between the pristine group and the group of Guam and the Maldives. Kauai is really a destination that's emphasized quality over quantity. And when back in 2017, it identified about 1.3 million visitor arrivals to be the limit under which the quality of life for its residents and the experience for visitors are still reasonable. Its visitor arrival to land ratio sits at about 2,500, which is significantly lower than that of Guam and the Maldives, for example. Guam, with 30% of its area leased for military use, the remaining land of around 140 square miles welcomed nearly 1.7 million visitors in 2019. And the Maldives, although it was positioned to be a one island, a one resort luxury concept in the beginning, visitor arrivals was growing quite moderately in the beginning up until about 2007, when it had just under 700,000 arrivals. But this grew more aggressively afterwards, surpassing 1.7 million in 2019. I'm moving on to the destinations in Southeast Asia. As you can see here, Bali, Phuket, Boracay. Boracay being the extreme example, a 4 square mile island that welcomed more than 2 million visitors. And the government in the Philippines, as you may know, closed Boracay for a couple of months to try and clean it up. But really the damages are very difficult to reverse, that from overdevelopment and over-tourism. And you can also see here that with estimated tourism spending, the data is not available for Bali and Phuket, but for Boracay, it is significantly lower than the other destinations listed here at about just $600. For the Marianas, this figure, the estimated tourism spending per visitor, is based on survey in 2011 and adjusted for inflation to 2019 values. And that's really looking at about 850, which there's a lot of room to grow compared to, for example, the next highest destination, Guam, which has a 40% premium over the Marianas. And once again, looking at Maldives, Kauai, Fiji, Palau, and French Polynesia, there's a lot of room to grow in the tourism spending per visitor area. Which brings us to talking about the target volume of visitors for the Marianas. Historically, in the late 90s, the peak of tourism arrivals reached about 730,000. With the aging infrastructure and limited availability of labor for the destination, these are critical issues that need to be recognized. I think it's not realistic to surpass the previous peak unless significant overhaul is made to the infrastructure and to the availability of labor. So given that premise, it's more ideal to focus on growing tourism spending. And as I highlighted before, there's a lot of room to grow, with even with the Marianas being about 40% behind the next highest destination on the list, which is Guam. And in terms of growing tourism spending, opportunities really lie within growing rate, but as well as lengthening the average length of stay. And if we look at the multi-island destination of Fiji, average length of stay is nearly 10 nights. And for Maldives, it's around 6 nights. Once again, there's a lot of room to grow for the Marianas. Which brings us to look at the target overnight visitor arrivals by island. For Saipan, we're looking at a target of about 700,000. Moving on to Tinian, this will be a combination of overnight and day use visitors. At 25,000, it's really looking at just a 5% capture of, if Saipan had 500,000 tourists, at the level of 500,000 tourists, a 5% capture would get to 25,000 visitors for Tinian. Again, for Rota, looking at a similar volume of overnight visitors, supplemented by the Northern Islands, which this is accounted for on the LIVEABOARD product. Combined, we're looking at just under 750,000 arrivals for the entire Marianas, and really growing the average length of stay to about 5 to 7 nights. Let's end with looking at some sustainable development issues. Number one being, once again, the importance of preservation. And given that the environment and the natural assets are what supports tourism in the Marianas in the first place, it is important to ensure the sustainability of tourism in the Marianas by preserving the environment and avoiding over-tourism. Ensuring that any new developments and upgrades to existing developments are of high quality, and really preparing the destination for the future. As we can see in this picture, this is Maya Bay in Thailand, which has now been closed for over 3 years because it experienced a lot of damages to the environment from over-tourism, having too many tourist visits. And this is really moving away, the world is moving away from that model of depletion and of tour groups, you know, all traveling at once to a pristine tourism destination, and moving more towards individual travel and FIT travel. And the picture really here shows that there's going to be a shift in the way people perceive travel and that people would like to travel in the future. Research has shown that the general public become more aware of their impact on the environment and would like to travel more responsibly going forward. And this is definitely a trend to stay, and the Marianas could really differentiate itself from the destinations in Southeast Asia, for example, by showcasing that it is a sustainable destination. And really now is an opportune and prime time to be looking at turning the Marianas into a sustainable multi-island destination. In the post-COVID travel era, people are going to be looking at safe destinations, particularly for markets in Asia, Japan, Korea, and China. They're going to be looking at a list of safe destinations where its citizens could travel. And I think, for example, Europe is going to be taking quite a long time for travel to be possible for residents in Asia. And that's good news for the Marianas, being a very safe destination, a small community that's done very well in terms of managing COVID. People are likely also going to be, as I mentioned, taking fewer trips, but longer trips, given that it is going to be more difficult to travel with restrictions and quarantines involved. They're going to be looking at making each of their trips more meaningful and ensure that they're great experiences. And really, with the multi-island destination product, the Marianas is in a great position to attract these people by offering a variety of experiences for one trip in one destination. And that really is about providing quality beach holidays for leisure travelers and incentive groups on Saipan. That's going to be supplemented by fun, unique cultural day trip attractions on Tinian. Once again, rounded out by niche rustic luxury retreats for top tier guests looking for special occasion experiences on Rota. And then finally, with true adventure experiences on the Northern Islands. And this really offers big variety of products that complement each other in one destination. Guests could choose to experience a mixture of different experiences on one trip. And it's really a prime time now to be preparing the destination for this, so that post-COVID, when people do start traveling, the destination is ready. And one of the preparation key components to prepare the destination is establishing an identity, one identity for the entire destination that is clear, simple, and easy to remember. And along with that, creating a website that is going to become a one-stop shop travel website that showcases the entire destination. And a good example to showcase this is the official travel website in Fiji. For Fiji, as you can see here, it categorizes things to do by the type of interest. For example, ecotourism, challenges, or calmer activities like bird watching, looking at national parks and marine parks. There's also a wish list function, which is great for people who are dreaming about traveling and planning. There's also separate pages for each main area in Fiji that gives it a clear identity within the multi-island destination that has critical information on the different areas and what their specialities are. And most importantly, for each of the service providers, for example, resorts, dive operators, all of these service providers in the entire destination, there's a standardized list of information that is provided by each service provider, and it's presented in a standardized way, so that when guests come to look for information, this one website is where they can find all the information for the different operators. And there's a booking button that takes the guests directly to booking functions for each service provider. And really having this as a way to plan and to book everything within the Marianas as a multi-island destination is going to be key. And I'll end today's presentation by looking at some potential itineraries for the multi-island destination. For example, for guests that may choose to only stay in Saipan for 4 to 5 nights, they have the option of taking a day trip to Tinian. Some guests may wish to spend 4 nights in Saipan, for example, including a day trip to Tinian, and move on to exploring Rota, and then once again flying out of Saipan. There's also the option for guests to spend 4 nights in Saipan, and while they're visiting Tinian, deciding to stay in Tinian and explore further by staying 1 night there. And then there's also the longer options at about 7 nights for guests to visit Saipan, as well as the Northern Islands and Tinian and Rota, all 4 of the islands, really ultimately looking at the entire Marianas. And we can see here that a lot of it is about providing different experiences and for the entire destination to be featured in different aspects. And really having the day trip option on Tinian will provide a great opportunity for guests who are staying on Saipan, who may not be going to the other islands to experience something different, but also for guests moving on to Rota and going to see the Northern Islands, also something different, which ties it all in together. And that's what I have for you today. Be great if we could have some discussions on what I presented. Thank you.